Hi there, Social Studies 20 here, taking a look at our third source, our final source of the week. Topic I chose was Rwanda, only because it's fresh in our heads. We were learning about it last week. We watched the Ghosts of Rwanda documentary. It made sense to me. So I'll give you a few seconds to examine the cartoon. I know it's tough to read. It's the best version that I could find. I'll take you through it in a few seconds. Okay, so when I first saw the cartoon, my eyes, of course, went to the foreground, a woman lying on the ground. There's not much to her. And then, of course, if you read close, it says Rwanda in red letters. It almost looks like it's been written in blood. So I'm left thinking right away, this is clearly the Rwandan genocide of 1994. She's lying prone, but her one hand is in the air. It almost looks like she's waving. Um, and we'll come back to that in a second. And then in the background, you have a group of people that look well-to-do. If you look close, one of them's wearing a tie. So what you're left to think is that these people represent the West. These people represent the Western Hemisphere, the developed countries, the countries that really could have done something about the genocide but didn't. It could be reflective of the UN Security Council. Specific countries, of course, would be America, probably Britain, probably France, and so on. And you would list, who you think that could represent, and then some of the quotes that they give. Uh, Now, what's that she's doing? She seems to be waving, I think. Does she want something? We should wave back, I suppose. Yes, indeed, as concerned nations, we ought not to appear rude. Hello, you-hoo. And, what you're left from all this is that the West um, didn't recognize what was going in Rwanda, when it was about to happen in Rwanda, when it was very obvious. I mean, after watching The Ghosts of Rwanda, it was very clear what was about to happen in Rwanda. I mean, after all, it didn't just happen, it had been building for months and maybe even years. And so what we're left thinking is that these people were oblivious to the genocide. And even if they knew it was a genocide, they weren't in a position to do much about it. Look how far away they are from the action. So that's done on purpose. Geographically, they are far away, they're on the periphery. Um, if they claim that they didn't know, it's only because they didn't look close enough and they really should have known. So um, this artist is rendering, his version of what happened in Rwanda as being at the fault of the West. They should have been closer to the action. They should have recognized what was going on. And all of the things they're saying make it clear they're oblivious to what was happening in Rwanda. Uh, I'm not sure what sure to make of the overturned pot and pans and stuff on the ground here. I think they're just trying to show that Rwanda decimated a million Tutsi, but also it decimated the infrastructure of the Tutsi. It decimated their ability to look after themselves down the road. It was more than just a physical genocide, I guess. And then finally, over on the left here, you can see the dark clouds. I think that is just the gathering storm that is about to become the Rwandan genocide. So, um, what they're witnessing might be the beginning of the genocide, and then what is about to come is the full scope of the genocide, the million deaths, the massacres, and so on. They're oblivious to what she's going through. They're oblivious to what's coming from the background. The UN really failed them in Rwanda, is the point this guy is trying to make. In terms of our connections, well, we see a critique of foreign policy. I mean, this guy's saying that if nations had been more involved in Rwanda in the first place, they would have recognized what was about to happen and could have been more proactive about it. Um, if they had recognized what was about to happen, if they'd been more involved, they could have put themselves in a better position to be peacemakers rather than just peacekeepers. Don't forget, peacekeeping is observation and not committing to either side. Peacemaking is taking action and committing to one of the two sides in a warring faction. That's probably as far as I would take that. Maybe you could also talk about how this is the failure of multilateralism. Several nations dropping the ball in Rwanda. It wasn't just America that failed Rwanda. It was the entire Western Hemisphere, you could argue, that failed Rwanda. So maybe you talk about how multilateralism has failed in the case of Rwanda. In terms of perspective, well, again, we get someone challenging, critiquing internationalism. It's one thing to say that you're involved internationally, but if you're not close enough to recognize what's going to happen, how can you really say that you were involved internationally? Clearly, in this guy's case, they weren't involved enough because they couldn't see what was about to happen. They had separated themselves from Rwanda too much. That's probably as far as I would take perspective. Uh, Good source. I hope you like that one. Let's do our relationships while we're at it. So there was source number one, again, a cartoon of Rwanda. This guy talking about, recognizing the role of the UN in Rwanda 20 years since. And you're probably left thinking, well, what role did they really play? And of course, this is done after dark when everyone's gone anyway. Source number two, just from yesterday, was your quote, and it talks about how in this case specifically, America didn't want a repeat of their failure in Somalia, so they sat out Rwanda by and large and decided to only get involved in Rwanda if it helped American interests. So it's kind of an excuse for why they didn't do what they really should have done. Again, a harsh critique on the lack of action in Rwanda. And then, of course, this is just today's one more cartoon. I'll give you a few seconds to piece some relationships together, then we'll take it up. So remember that we need a theme, a concept that connects all three sources. That is one relationship. And so when looking back at the sources, well, I mean, you could say they're all about Rwanda. That would be a very basic, rudimentary uh, approach. But probably you're going to say that all three sources are critiquing the role of the UN in helping the Rwandan genocide, the lack of helping in the Rwandan genocide. So source one clearly is a scathing critique of the lack of help that the UN gave Rwanda, and this one is looking back. This one is trying to say they haven't even reconciled that they failed Rwanda in the first place. It's showing how oblivious the UN was when the genocide actually happened, and how oblivious it is now 20 years later, in that they didn't really do anything to help in Rwanda. Source number two is much the same, and a very scathing critique. Source two is actually going right after the Americans for its failure to help in Rwanda. And then finally, source three it is blaming, all countries of the West, not just America, not just a handful of countries, but all countries were oblivious to what was about to happen when they really should have known what was about to happen because it's very obvious. How can you miss this gathering storm coming from the left? So that could be one relationship, a critique of the failure of the UN to act in Rwanda. Remember that you need one more relationship if you want to get a good mark on this. I was thinking maybe when I look at these three sources, this one is kind of just before or during the genocide. This one is looking back on the genocide 20 years later, and they still haven't accepted guilt or fault for what happened. And this one is looking back on the genocide again, and this one is affixing guilt to a particular country, in this case, America. So what you get is this one kind of going on at that time, this one looking back, and this one looking back on the failure of Rwanda. That's probably as far as you want to go with your sources. We'll do one more set of sources next week, and they will deal with internationalism one more time. And then I think you're well set for grade 12 in doing source interpretations because you will have to do the diploma next year, and you have to do a source interpretation, and you'll be well set to do that. All right, thanks for listening.